Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Parkinson's Disease Education Podcast. I'm, of course, your host, Dr. Michael Hyland, physical therapist, and I have with me Martha Carlin, who is the founder of BioCollective and BioCollective. And we are going to be talking about a lot of things involving the gut-brain axis and the microbiome and those connections with Parkinson's disease. 44 years old. So after the intro, we're going to be talking about that in depth. Don't go anywhere, sit tight, and we're going to roll that intro and come right back. Welcome to the Parkinson's Disease Education Show, where we demystify the disease and empower you as the person with Parkinson's disease to reach your true potential. The content contained on this show is for informational purposes only and is not meant to be a replacement for information or advice that you receive from your in-person medical or therapy professionals. If you haven't already, I hope you'll consider subscribing, and for an even more personalized experience, please ask us about our memberships. Now, without further ado, let's start the show. All right, we're back from the intro, and I appreciate you being here, and welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. When the gentleman reached out about connecting, I had to reread the email a couple of different times, but I did get the gist of the fact that this would be a great conversation. I've done some coverage of gut-brain axis and the microbiome on the podcast in the past, but I'd love to speak with somebody like you who's involved in this up to the eyeball, so to speak, and beyond. So tell me a little bit about I mentioned your husband earlier. Tell me about your background a little bit and how basically what has come about today with these companies came from that original beginning of your husband having the Parkinson's diagnosis at such a young age.
Yes. So my background and training had been in college was in accounting, a system that has to balance. I came out of school. I was trained as an auditor, never take anything at face value, examine the evidence yourself. And I was also trained in something called transaction flow review, which is how you identify risk in a business. And you are drawing flow charts of everything flowing through the business, who touches it, what happens. And you are then going through and interviewing and examining to see if that's what's really happening. I went on from accounting into business operations and was kind of a business turnaround expert. And my husband, I was 40 and John was 44, and he was he looked healthy on the outside. He was a marathon runner, and we had young children, and he was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And I was like, how is a young person who looks so vital have a old person's disease? And so I just kind of took that auditor's mindset and started examining the evidence, and started with food first, food and water, because those are the two main things flowing through the body, and spent more than a decade looking at the food supply, changing our diet, really examining what had happened in our food supply over the last 100 years, how we were growing food, chemicals, all of that, and really seeing the implications of herbicides and pesticides used in the food and the potential for harm in Parkinson's. But in 2014, I read Martin Blazer's book, Missing Microbes, and he was talking about growing up in the age of antibiotics. I knew my husband had had a lot of strep infections as a child, so taken a lot of antibiotics. And I had learned from many other people with Parkinson's that I had talked to that they had also had a history of either strep infections or antibiotics for ear infections or acne treatment in their teens. And so that made a lot of sense to me. And later that year, the first paper was published connecting Parkinson's and the microbiome, and showing that you could divide the two different types of Parkinson's, posture and gait, from tremor by the bacteria in the gut. Right. And I was like, that's it. And I quit my very high paying job and decided to start doing some research at the University of Chicago. I contracted for some research there, and met my co-founder, and we founded the BioCollective to start collecting people's poop samples basically in a bottle.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
making those available to scientists all over the world. And that was 2015. And it was at that point, not a lot of people had even heard the term the microbiome or knew, that we're actually more microbial than we are human. Now there are 2,500 Parkinson's microbiome papers, and
Yeah.
more and more evidence of the connection to not only the gut microbiome, but the oral microbiome, maybe what's nasal microbiome, also,
Hmm.
disruption of this whole ecosystem. But through that process of founding that company, just got deeper and deeper and deeper into the science. And, I've published a lot of peer-reviewed papers, both on the microbiome, on environmental factors in agriculture, and most recently, I have a publication called Gut, Brain, and Glycocalyx, a portrait of Parkinson's, that explains the physical chemistry of Parkinson's and how different things can actually impact the glycocalyx in different ways, or different parts of the body that can present as different symptom profiles.
I wanted to explain a little bit about that terminology because glycocalyx to somebody outside of bioscience or medical sciences or biochemistry, biological sciences, period, but may not be familiar with that. But in short, all of our cells in the body have essentially we have these proteins embedded in cell membranes called glycoproteins. And those glycoproteins, essentially, as they kind of are found all along that cellular surface, they kind of form this, if not for lack of a better term, this kind of a fuzzy layer. Yeah, as you did the that's perfect.
Like
The fingers.
Yeah, it's like seaweed.
If you're not watching this on a video format, you'll want to check it out. But yeah, so basically these finger-like projections from the cellular membranes, and the glycocalyx is like this fuzzy kind of layer on the outside, and since it's a sugary layer, has some glucose involved. It's a little bit of a kind of sticky-ish, you might say, layer, and it's actually one of the ways our cells communicate with each other and tell who's who. Are you you? Yep, I'm me. Are you you? Yep, we're good. So anyway, that's part of the it's in a way, it's kind of part of our cellular identification system within the body and how our immune system can pick up on what's not right. And so I haven't read the paper, but I'm assuming there's a connection between the microbiome, or basically an issue with the microbiome, and the health of the glycocalyx of those. I'm assuming it's the intestinal cells, or is
Yes,
it?
well,
Yeah,
I mean, the intestinal cells, the brain, the cardiovascular system, it's
all the
all
above.
connected.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that's missed as well, is that the glycocalyx lines are blood vessels.
Uh-huh.
And as you are having
Interesting.
glycocalyx damage from a lot of these different factors, you can have vascular problems. And one of the things in
Yeah.
Parkinson's is problems with blood pressure,
Yes.
and I think it has not been well connected, that vascular tone and problems with the glycocalyx are connected to Parkinson's. And my husband actually passed away from a pulmonary embolism after
Oh
long
man.
COVID. And the spike protein from COVID also does a lot of damage to the glycocalyx. And so,
Uh-huh.
these pieces of the puzzle haven't been well connected because our science is so compartmentalized and reductionist.
I'm sorry to hear about the loss of your husband.
Thank you.
Um, and yeah, that's this is a different topic, but and correlation doesn't equal causation. But I will say, after 2020, in our therapy practice, we noticed a huge uptick of new diagnosis of Parkinson's. A lot of referrals with people diagnosed within, and these are people of all ages between not young onset, but 65 plus up to 90 plus, and yeah, just within like new diagnosis between 2020 and 2022, big uptick.
There's a couple of things there. So the spike protein does damage to the glycocalyx, but
Right.
another thing that is a huge risk factor for the glycocalyx damage and for our immune system damaging the membranes is the uptick in cleaning compounds called quaternary ammonium compounds.
Mm.
And those, every place you went, somebody was squirting you with hand sanitizer or spraying you or spraying the surfaces. And everybody's running around trying to buy things that kill 99.9% of bacteria. Well, guess what? Bacteria also have a glycocalyx, and most of
Right.
those cleaners are attacking the same thing. I mean, it's attacking what we have too. So,
Right.
and even so one of the things I worked on for the last 2 years with someone from the Resolve Parkinson Foundation is a docu-series of interviews called Voices of Parkinson's. And we talked to a young onset Parkinson's orthopedic surgeon who was
Mm-hmm.
diagnosed about a year into COVID. And one of the things we discussed was the fact that they had changed what they were cleaning his operating theater with. And, they're
Oh,
coming in there
yeah.
with hazmat suits, spraying it, multiple times a day. And then he's in there around all of those surfaces. And, that's going to increase your risk of these kinds of things.
That's very interesting. With the collection that you were doing of feces from different individuals, was I don't know if it's even relevant, but what particular bacteria were um, found to be, I guess, absent or um, either
Right.
absent or not in enough
Abundance.
number, basically?
Well, I'll tell you a couple things. So, um, the first one didn't require doing any kind of sequencing or knowing who was there or what was going on. The people in our lab processing the samples could tell a person that had Parkinson's just by looking at the stool. A Parkinson's
Wow.
stool is very different from any other stool we collected from anybody. And it has components of it, sometimes the whole stool, but sometimes just sections of it are like concrete.
Hardened. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, very, very hard, a very, very hard consistency and dry. And this is actually also explained in our paper by the battle in the gut. And there are some pathogenic bacteria that produce an enzyme called urease, which
Mm-hmm.
has a lot of downstream effects, but it kills good bacteria and good cells. And then they spill calcium and potassium into the gut lumen, which
Mm-hmm.
when you do that, you lose basically sodium is what propagates electrical signals. And so when there's too much potassium inside the lumen, you lose that signal propagation through the sodium in the glycocalyx. And
Mm.
then a tiny bit of calcium is all it takes to make something kind of like concrete. But back to the
Interesting.
question about, bacteria that are missing. So a lot of the bacteria that are missing in Parkinson's are those that produce something called butyrate, which is a short chain fatty acid that actually feeds those cells
Yep.
that line the gut. And the lining of the gut is only one cell thick.
That's right. Yeah. It's just that simple columnar epithelium. Yeah.
Yep. And that's the same thing with our blood vessels. Only like that line, that little piece of the that endothelial cell is one cell thick. So it's
Right.
different than like the skin. If you cut your skin, there's
Yeah.
other cells underneath that are growing up to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And, when you damage the glycocalyx, there's not something coming up to the surface. It's actually repaired by blood clots. So blood comes to the
Right.
glycocalyx, and then those blood cells, send some signals and do some repair. But that's also how you can get a blood clot.
Yeah, that's interesting. All this is very interesting. I didn't realize before. I wouldn't know. I hadn't heard anybody actually state this before, but it makes sense to me that the consistency of stool would be different for various reasons. Of course, if there's changes in the bacteria, that makes sense, and changes in electrolytes, like you mentioned, potassium, calcium, and so forth. And also, it's ironic too, because as a catch-22 with Parkinson's, you've got the autonomic nervous system issues causing the gut motility problems, but you also have, again, with the bacteria in the gut being altered, you've got the stool that it's harder to move anyway if it's harder physically.
Right.
by harder, I mean more solid and drier. And also, you have the issue of medications even more slowing down the gut.
Yeah, it's very tricky. And when the stool is sitting in the body, this is something I'll say near and dear to my heart because when waste is sitting in your body, your immune system is having to deal with recycling the metabolic waste because
Mm-hmm.
it's sitting there. And so one of the things that is more present in Parkinson's is gram-negative bacteria that produce endotoxins. They
Okay,
produce
yeah.
something called lipopolysaccharide. The cell wall of those bacteria is highly inflammatory. There are over 500 papers using an animal model that takes lipopolysaccharide to initiate Parkinson's-like symptoms. So, when I look at these animal models, I'm like, okay, well, why aren't you asking yourself, how's that happening in the human body? Well, if
Yeah.
you're sitting there with a lot of waste in your GI tract that has endotoxin, your body is dealing with a lot of those inflammatory compounds.
Right. And we know chronic inflammation is a big issue with Parkinson's, both in the brain and in the gut. And so, but not just the whole body, honestly.
Yeah.
And so doing whatever is possible to reduce that inflammation. Obviously, there's multiple things to talk about here in terms of systems-based approaches versus symptom-based approaches. I kind of alluded to the fact that symptom-based approach is levodopa and other medications. Systems-based approaches is approaches like something like supplementation for the microbiome, um, focus on ketosis and autophagy, exercise. All of that is system-based. And so I guess what I'm getting at is the focus tends to be more symptom-based in medicine. And unfortunately, and I think you alluded to this earlier, there's a lack of curiosity of,
Yes.
oh, this happens in this other mammal. Is it really happening that way, the same way in people? Why couldn't it? It's theoretically possible. So, and there's not really a focus on that kind of research as much as there probably should be. And I don't like to be cynical because that's not my personality. But I've known so many people with Parkinson's over the last 14 years, and I get where they're coming from with this. Is that you know there's just no money in a cure, and so and I think unfortunately a lot of focus tends to be toward medicine,
Right.
and other treatments versus what we're talking about today.
I have been, I'll say, a little more cynical, maybe than you. I mean, I am an internal optimist. That's why I've spent so much time
Same.
looking for solutions. But at the same time, I'm also pretty practical about what I see. And I tell people with Parkinson's, you're the market. So
Yeah.
anybody who is making money off the market is less inclined to get rid of the market. And
Yep.
and that's everything from, big nonprofits to drug companies to scientists. Because if your whole career in science is on studying one little thing about Parkinson's, and if you look at scientific papers, almost to the T, at the end of every scientific paper, it will say, more research is needed.
Yep.
Yes, we found blah, 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 but more research is needed. So give me my next grant.
Right. You see that a lot.
Yeah. And it's like, okay, well, somebody out there must be getting closer to an answer. Well, no, because the way the system is designed, it's not designed to do that. And so, my 25 years have been, I'm going to figure this out and I'm going to do that by finding the right scientists and getting them to help me figure it out.
Well, I think it says a lot that you've continued this beyond your husband's living with us, and that you have a passion for finding those answers. So I think that's to your credit, um, and I appreciate that. I think a question I had too, specifically related to BioCollective, which that's not a strange name in most households, I would think, because I've seen it advertised myself even before our conversation. Um, and there's a lot of different supplements there. I was curious if you'd found, anecdotally or through any research internally or anywhere, is there a particular set of those that are offered that are particularly beneficial as far as like symptoms or um, you know, gut symptoms of Parkinson's or other symptoms, anything?
The reason why I ended up making probiotics in the first place was that John and I went to the World Parkinson's Congress in 2016. And
Uh-huh.
at that time, so he was 14 years into his diagnosis and he was starting to use a cane and
Mm-hmm.
having some trouble navigating through crowds. And these researcher, it was actually a citizen science group called Clinic Crowd, was presenting published research from a scientist in Israel that showed that the sugar alcohol mannitol could stop the aggregation of the proteins. I don't know if
Oh,
you've ever
wow.
seen that, but and it could pull the proteins out of the brain of the mouse. And I was like, wow, this is pretty interesting. So I came back and I bought this little mannitol chemistry book and I start reading about this incredible molecule. It's a free radical scavenger. It's an osmoprotectant.
Hmm.
Um, it's used a lot in brain trauma. So, if you have a
Hmm.
concussion or brain edema,
Mm-hmm.
it's used for that. It's also used to help drug delivery into the brain because it crosses the blood-brain barrier.
Huh.
Anyway, the first chapter of the book was about there's a handful of microbes that convert glucose and fructose, and fructose in particular, into
Mm-hmm.
mannitol. And I had a friend who was a fermentation chemist and uh, had been in the probiotics industry for 20 years. And I sat down with him and I said, could we like make a team of microbes that could put this function back into the gut? And he said, well, I think we could. And one of the microbes actually happened to be a strain of bacteria called Lactobacillus reuteri that he had been doing a lot of work on, and he had a particular strain. And so
Mm-hmm.
we were able to prototype this formula in 90 days and give it to my husband. He started taking it about Christmas time. And 30 days later, he was no longer walking with a cane. And 4 months later, he was able to navigate a crowd of 5,000 people at our daughter's graduation. And his UPDR score went from a 35 to a 20 and
Wow.
stayed there for 4 years. But we also had his microbiome data from before, and we could see that it had moved back closer to the healthy human microbiome. So,
Wow, that's fascinating.
so we made it available. We just let people try it. Not a lot of them didn't have Parkinson's, and people would say, "Boy, this really fixed my constipation, or it fixed my gut," and so we put it up on our website and let people buy it. Made it in small batches and didn't really advertise it or do anything with that. And then in 2021, after COVID, and we decided it wasn't too smart to continue collecting stool samples, and we had taken that idea and modeled these other formulas to, for anxiety and sleep and other things, and we decided to bring them to the market. But I wanted to do a clinical trial, but in Parkinson's, there are not a lot of agreed upon endpoints where you could say, okay, this was successful. I mean, we did know with
Mm-hmm.
John, it moved his UPDR score, but UPDR scores are very subjective because every doctor is going to.
Right. They're interpreting the physical limitations a certain way. Yeah.
So, but I had some other data from a hospital system that showed that people with Parkinson's, it was looking at comorbidities of, I think it was
Yeah.
like 20,000 patients. And one of the top comorbidities was insulin resistance.
Insulin resistance. That's interesting. Okay.
And about 60% of the people had some form of blood sugar dysregulation, either hypoglycemia or hyperglycemia.
Huh.
And so, and we knew that it was converting sugars. So we said, okay, let's do a clinical trial in diabetes. And we knew that in Parkinson's, the lipopolysaccharide was one of the animal model things. And it's also an animal model in diabetes and in depression. And so
Wow.
we
Yeah.
decided to measure serum endotoxin or serum LPS. and also measure it in the microbiome. And so the clinical trial was 90 days, significant movement in endotoxin, in the reduction in LPS. And then we unblinded at the end of the study and took some of the people who had been on the product and kept them on for another 90 days. And at the end of the 180 days, the LPS was almost entirely gone. So
Wow.
we had shifted the microbiome dramatically. And then in our microbiome data, we could see we brought the gut back to an anaerobic state, which is what it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to have oxygen inside. And that allowed some of those really good butyrate producing bacteria to come back, which is also what we saw in John. But, you know, we still haven't done a Parkinson's clinical trial. But what I get from Parkinson's people is it has been very helpful for many of them with the severe constipation. And, you know, by making mannitol in your gut, you're also, it's an osmoprotectant, but it's also an osmoregulator. So it will pull fluid into the colon and help soften that stool.
Right. And mannitol, is it? I'm trying to think. It's not a sugar? Is it a sugar alcohol?
It's a sugar alcohol, but it's a really it's a very interesting model because it's also used in preservation of mitochondria when you're, you know, in the lab, in the petri dishes or whatever. That's part of the media, mannitol.
Interesting.
And same thing for red blood cells. It helps protect blood cells. So part of what I've been working on with Dr. Ninham, who I wrote the Parkinson's paper with, is like, we think it's also because that glycocalyx layer around the fuzzy layer around the cells, it's a highly hydrated, got a lot of water in it. And so we think that mannitol may be helping somehow be an osmoregulator inside the glycocalyx as well. But we have to figure out a way to test that.
That's really interesting, though. And I hadn't heard that connection for sure before this conversation about, because generally speaking, they'll tell you to stay away from sugar alcohols. But it sounds like mannitol is probably one that is, well, you actually say it yourself, it reduces oxidative stress because it's a free radical. It would eliminate free radicals. Did you say that earlier? Yeah.
Yes. But some of the other sugar alcohols they can be problematic, but they did a citizen science study where they had people actually just take oral mannitol, and they made a documentary about it. There was a lot of information about it. It was really interesting. There is a scientist who writes a Parkinson's blog. I can't remember the name of it now, but he did several really long write-ups about mannitol and the research about mannitol. And then all of a sudden, all the information disappeared or became very hard to find. And another study was done in a different hospital in Israel that has an interest in Parkinson's diagnostics. And that study came out and published and said mannitol isn't any good. But if you read the paper, which I did, and you have to go when you read a paper, you have to read the methods, because the methods are going to tell you how they set the experiment up to get the results that they wanted. Right. And basically, they had set this experiment up with a control, which I think, if I remember correctly, they used dextran, which is a sugar.
Yeah. Dextran is like a synthetic kind of...
with some similar properties. So anyway, I was like, they didn't set it up with a real control. They set it up with a control to make it so that it wasn't more beneficial. And, you know, most people don't know how to read through the junk in a paper to identify, pardon my French, but I'm going to say the bullshit.
Say it like it is, right?
Yeah. Anyway, and there is a lot, and you know, I probably have 10,000 papers in my paper database, because that's how I educated myself, is reading scientific papers and reading textbooks and different things. And you learn over time. Oh, well, you know, that doesn't make any sense. And then you go back and look, and it's like, oh, this is why.
A different topic, but statistical analysis is also important. if you see studies and they say like these results are really awesome, but then you look at like the comparative data and look at statistical changes, it's like,
Yeah.
I took statistics in undergraduate before I went to graduate school, and there's a reason they wanted us to do that, is because when you go through research studies and your p values are like, I won't go into statistics, bore people to death, but basically, if the p values, the comparative changes aren't significant enough, then it's worthless. It's like
Right.
when you're comparing data. So, but that's interesting that it was basically shadow banned because
It's cheap. It's cheap, and it's a simple way to see. Maybe you have a benefit, maybe you don't, but it's worth trying because there's no harm.
sure, yeah, I agree.
And yeah, for the fact that they had this great documentary, and all this work went into it, and I mean, you really have to dig to find it.
Well, the fact that it's kind of been quashed says a lot, you
Yeah,
know.
exactly.
Um, so yeah, we won't go into conspiracies on that, but anyway, that's interesting, and I think that it's worth considering. Again, curiosity. Why not look into stuff? If it and it sounds like as mannitol being something that could have an effect on alpha synuclein and other abnormal proteins. I mean, that's huge too. And there's a lot of focus on that in research right now, but a lot of it is pharmaceutical. So,
Well, so another thing that I learned in digging into the process of the fermentation of or mannitol and fermentation.
mhm,
So proteins are also fermented by bacteria,
right.
and an acidic pH causes more rapid fermentation of proteins, which is interesting. And mannitol is a neutral molecule, so it will bring the pH
pH to more to neutral. Yeah.
more to neutral. So I think that's one of the mechanisms when you're restoring a system of manufacturing, you're restoring a system that is sort of managing pH also.
Hmm.
So
And
anyway, that's the one I made for John, and it's called Sugar Shift.
sugar shift. I've heard that talked about on the website, I think. So that's one I know I'm familiar with the name of that one, but as far as individuals with Parkinson's are concerned, it sounds like that one would be beneficial. Is there any other that you'd recommend based on the ones you have?
Well, I think one we brought out last fall, which is called Perfect Peace, and it's for stress and anxiety,
Uh-huh.
which, that's also very, well, I mean, it's widely prevalent in the population because we're just under so many stressors and so much information, and
Yes.
just we're pulled in so many directions. And that's one, we've had somebody show us on their tracker, one on a Ura and one on a Whoop, that you can basically see the score or the stress score just level off after about 15 or 20 minutes. I don't have one of those
Yeah.
trackers, but I personally, I take it, and I could just, if I'm having a stressful day, I can just feel myself just kind of, it's almost like I'm letting taking a deep breath and relaxing. It's very
Yeah.
interesting. So I think that would also be beneficial, just because there's just this underlying stress that is always there with Parkinson's. And, was
Yeah.
probably there before a Parkinson's diagnosis, but then once you get a diagnosis, then there's, even more underlying stress.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's the thing too, is like you have to think about triggers for Parkinson's in the first place, but then also this kind of cycle that can happen where um, there's trauma of some kind that may have been some contribution to onset of PD, and then once you have Parkinson's, you have the depression and anxiety that can happen as part of
Right.
the disease process as well.
Well, you're a physical therapist.
Yes.
You're probably familiar with the Human Garage guy, or do you know him?
I don't remember actually.
He's on TikTok and I think Instagram, but I've had tons of people send me videos of him working on a couple of different people with Parkinson's,
Mm,
and he talks about trapped emotions and trauma in the
Yeah.
body,
Hmm.
and he like shows like moving it out with the physical work that he does.
Oh,
And you
interesting.
see he has the before and after picture. You can see him walking and standing, and the difference in the shoulder, and it's pretty amazing. But that also came out in our in the Voices of Parkinson's interviews, and so many of the people had had some kind of a traumatic event. It might have
Yeah.
been one, it might have been a lifetime of trauma, but often it was a traumatic event. And it didn't always have to be like immediately before the diagnosis. It could have been
Right.
5 or 6 years before, but it
Yes.
triggered something. And one of the things I talk about in my book is trying to put together the pieces of what that might have been for my husband. Because there's a woman named Janice Hadlock who's a traditional Chinese medicine, and she has a book about Parkinson's called Stuck on Pause, where like people were in imminent danger of death, or they had some kind of shock that was like that.
Yeah.
And I went back and thought about it. My husband had been on a rafting trip in 1997, so that would have been 5 years before he was diagnosed. They went down the Gunnison River and flipped their raft, and the raft got pinned against a rock, and there was no way out of the canyon except floating in their life vests for like 36 hours in
Wow.
in like 45-degree water. And so he was pretty much and in class 4 and 5 rapids. So
That's
for
a pretty big trauma.
that is a huge trauma. And I didn't really even realize how traumatic that was until I started writing about it in my book and went back, because he didn't talk about it after he came back home. And
Yeah.
I reached out to one of his friends who was on the trip with him to make sure that I got this story right. And he said, we don't like to talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing is like a lot of those traumas you try to repress, and push it back. Yeah. Push it
Yeah.
down, push it down into the memory somewhere. But
Yeah.
there's the book, the famous book called "The Body Keeps the Score," um,
Yes.
and so there's little T traumas, which is like I guess you could technically call that a big T trauma. But anyway, there's little T traumas that happen throughout life. Someone spoke to you the wrong way this time, or you had this hurt in your life, or whatever the event might be. And then there's the big T traumas like sexual abuse and accidents and scary things, near death experiences. But the body remembers all that, and your brain and your body remember it. Even if you try to suppress that memory, it will come out physiologically in ways. So I do think there's a big connection there with a lot of individuals with PD, whether it's spoken or unspoken.
Yeah.
And I've certainly heard stories like yours of somebody that had a near-death experience or near drowning. For example, I know someone that almost drowned, and I think the anoxic part of the injury to their brain caused Parkinson's disease
Mhm.
because they got it later. Um, so anyway, we went off on a tangent, but I think that's there's just so many connections, and I'm fond of saying that PD is a whole body disease. It's a whole person disease, and it's a multi system condition. So we can't just look at it as a brain disease. My personal phrase that I like to use, my personal explanation of Parkinson's, is that Parkinson's disease is really a metabolic disease disguised as a brain disorder.
I
So,
absolutely believe that.
and that ties in with our conversation actually, because gut brain axis, and the gut microbiome directly ties it in with metabolism.
Well, that also goes back to my husband's marathon running. And that's another area that I've explored a lot deeper after he passed away. But how the metabolism shifts, when somebody is doing a marathon, they are putting the body under tremendous strain. They are
Yes.
often loading
Mm-hmm.
carbohydrates, so they're training their body to burn sugars.
Yep.
They
For
are
energy. Mm-hmm.
Yep, and they are running out of sugar. So they're flipping back and forth between glycogen and sugar that they're consuming, and frankly, confusing the hell out of their system. Plus the pounding and when you go long distances, the blood is moving out into the muscles and away from the gut. But when you
Yep.
stop running, it rushes back into the gut and you get reperfusion
Injury. Hmm.
injury. It's like a tongue twister. Injury in all the little tiny blood vessels in the lining of the gut. And then you get this leaky gut where the endotoxin crosses over and you get the inflammation. So, all these little pieces kind of came together.
Well, it's interesting too. What you said there is because as important as exercise is for Parkinson's disease, there's different ways of doing that. And if something like a marathon, well, let's just take short-term exercise. Let's say intense 20 to 30 minute cardio, or 45 minutes to an hour of high intensity repetitive exercises, LSBT, big rock steady, boxing, power moves, whatnot. That's important in short bouts, but doing something like a marathon, I mean, that's 21.6 miles, or is it 22? Anyway, it's 21
Yeah.
plus miles, and you're not stopping. So your body, and when you exercise, you're in sympathetic nervous system mode, which is
Mhm.
your fight or flight. So as Martha said, that's correct about the shunting of blood, because your blood will go to the extremities during fight or flight because you need that blood flow and nutrients and waste taking away from you need all that in your muscles and in your posture, all those muscles that are activated, especially when you're running or jogging. And so, yeah, there's not going to be as much blood flow to your gut. And then you stop exercising after 20 plus miles. And yeah, all that blood flow is going to be returning to your core, because you're going to be coming down from sympathetic into parasympathetic, which is your rest and digest. And so that's an interesting perspective I hadn't thought of actually until now, is that, yeah, you do some exercise is great, but if you do high intensity exercise for really long periods of time, could be a little different. Yeah.
Can be worse. But, John was very involved in bringing pedaling for Parkinson's,
Yep.
the biking program that came out of Jay Alberts at the Cleveland Clinic.
Yep.
John helped get that set up all across the country, and he was very involved in the cycling and had a lot of great symptom relief from
Yeah.
doing the spinning bike.
Yeah. Those forced intensive exercises are very beneficial, but it's not quite a marathon. Definitely is a little more.
No, it's not. Well, yeah, there's a lot of things that are different about it.
Yeah, for sure. One more question I had, and well, two really, but the first question I had before we start to wrap up is there any specific research you wanted to mention where we're trying to, I think you already talked about some of it, but is there any other research going on right now that's challenging the traditional kind of the traditional model of put a Band-Aid on it, you know?
Well, I would say, and I'm sure you've seen Ray Dorsey and Michael O'Kuhn's new book,
Yeah.
Parkinson's Plan. I
Yes.
think that does a really nice job of talking about all these chemical exposures.
I agree. It's a good book.
It's a really good book, but I was kind of surprised that they only had like one page on the microbiome, because all of these chemical pieces play into the microbiome. But I was very excited about the book, and I think that goes a long way. The 25 things in the back that they tell people
Yep.
to avoid. I think that is really important work, and we're starting to see from that perspective and from the two of them, really, because
Yeah.
I follow them pretty closely, talking about these other factors and starting to look at it systemically. So
Yeah.
I'm
I,
excited about that.
I
But
agree,
I
because
still
that breaks
think,
through I'm sorry.
oh, that's good. I talked to people who went to the World Parkinson's Congress, and they were like, well, they kept saying, yeah, we know the gut's involved, but we don't really know what to do. And I'm like, there are so many people working on this. Like, you could have, I mean, you could have a whole World Parkinson's Congress just on the gut brain and how to,
Oh yeah.
you know,
I mean, I
have an
talked to
impact. Yeah.
there's you doing this forward thinking work now, but also in the past, but also Dr. Wayne Markman, with Symbix Biome.
Oh, yeah. I know him.
They're doing he's a great guy, and I interviewed him last year. They're doing they're doing in the UK in particular. They're doing research on the microbiome and the use of the laser, or I mean, sorry, not the laser, the red light therapy.
Yeah.
For that.
I think that's a really exciting area.
Light therapy
And
is.
light therapy and some of the pulsed electromagnetic therapy and some of these different the one, what is it? The ultrasound.
Focused ultrasound.
Yeah, focused ultrasound. I think that's Ali Rezai or yeah, Dr. Rezai. He was at the Cleveland Clinic. John actually saw him years ago when he was at the Cleveland Clinic, but he's gone on to do the ultrasound, I think, which is pretty interesting.
There may be some other treatments out there we're not thinking of, because focused ultrasound is a permanent lesion made in the brain, in the areas. It's MRI guided, and that's there. It targets the areas of the brain that are basically short circuiting with tremor. So it's particularly for those with tremor, but there's also transcranial electromagnetic field research being done.
Yep.
I don't know if that's what you're thinking, but maybe that's something like that.
I have to go back. I've looked at both of those. I think are pretty interesting, though.
Yeah, I agree. The other main question I had before we conclude, I guess, is, Martha, is there any other recommendation you would make for anybody watching and listening to this?
I mean, I recommend the Parkinson's Plan book just so that people are aware of all of the different things that they are being exposed to in daily life that they may not be aware of, that they should be mindful of. And I am working on a book called The New Parkinson's Paradigm, which I hope to have out by the end of the year, that's going to put all these pieces together and give you a framework for how to have a different trajectory. And, I like to point out, John had Parkinson's for 22 years. He was still climbing mountains, and, we were ice climbing and doing all kinds of things in Colorado until he got COVID in 2021. So,
yeah,
Parkinson's doesn't have to end the adventure in your life. And I want people
Amen.
to know that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that, for sure. And for those of you not familiar with the Parkinson's Plan book, I think most of you probably are, but if you're not, I'll leave a link to that below as well. Dr. Oku and I had him on the podcast last year as well, and we talked about that at length, and I can link that video as well up above once this is on the YouTube side. But I do encourage you also to check that out, because that's a really good book, and it's very encouraging for the future in how we manage Parkinson's disease. I know people are impatient. We need a cure. We need this and that right now. I agree, but we got to do something. So this is definitely a step in the right direction as well. And doing something like the BioCollective supplementation is also something you can try, that there's no harm, no foul in doing something to be proactive in managing the disease process. So I really thank you for your time today, and for reaching out about coming onto the podcast. I'm really excited about seeing where things go with the research, and also with your company as well.
Well, I appreciate you having me on here and letting me tell the people with Parkinson's all the work I've been doing, and let them know I'm not giving up.
Yeah, amen to that. Yeah, never give up. That's the lesson for everybody in dealing with this. All right, well, everybody, thank you for watching and listening. It was great to be on again, and look forward to the next episode. Until then, be empowered. We'll catch you later.